The carriage wheel struck the loose stone and the whole cabin lurched sideways, throwing Charlotte Hale against the door. She caught herself with both hands and looked out at the rain hammering the window in gray sheets. The driver shouted something she could not hear over the storm, and the horses screamed. She had known this journey was a mistake the moment she stepped into the carriage that morning. Her aunt had written only 3 lines. "Come at once. Your uncle has made an arrangement for you. Do not be late." There had been no warmth in the words, no explanation, only the cold certainty of a decision already made without her. Charlotte pressed her hand against the fogged glass and watched the road disappear beneath a wall of falling water. The river crossing at Marlwood had never frightened her before. She had crossed it a dozen times as a child, in fair weather, with her father holding the reins himself. But her father was 3 years gone now, and the man driving this carriage was a stranger hired by her aunt, and the river below the old stone bridge was rising faster than any river had a right to rise. The carriage slowed. Charlotte leaned forward and rapped her knuckles against the roof. "What is happening?" she called out. "The bridge," the driver shouted back. "The water has taken part of it." "Then go around," she said. "There must be another way." "There is no time, madam. The current is still climbing. If we wait for morning, the road behind us will flood as well." Charlotte sat back against the seat and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She did not like the driver's voice. It had the thin, stretched sound of a man trying to convince himself as much as her. She thought of asking him to turn back, to find shelter in the village they had passed an hour before, but she knew what waited for her there would be no better than what waited ahead. Her aunt's letter sat folded in her small bag, damp already at the edges, and she found herself thinking of the arrangement it promised, rather than the storm outside. A husband chosen without her knowledge, a future decided in 3 cold lines. She had spent the whole journey turning the letter over in her mind, searching for some way to refuse it, and had found none that did not end in disgrace or poverty. Perhaps, she thought bitterly, the river ahead was no more dangerous than the life waiting for her on the other side of it. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her father's voice, steady and unhurried, guiding the horses across this same crossing on a summer afternoon years before. He had always said the river respected patience and punished haste. She wondered if the hired driver knew that, or cared. Before she could decide, the carriage jolted forward and the wheels found the bridge. For a moment it seemed as though they might cross safely. The old stones held, and the horses moved with careful, frightened steps, and Charlotte allowed herself to breathe. Then she heard a crack beneath them, sharp and final, like a bone breaking, and the world tipped. The carriage went sideways first, then down. Water burst through the door seams before she understood what was happening, cold enough to steal the air from her lungs. She heard the horses screaming again, farther away now, and the driver's voice cut off entirely. The carriage rolled once, twice, and Charlotte lost all sense of which way was up. She fought the door. Her fingers found the handle and pulled, but the pressure of the river held it shut as though a great hand were pressing from the other side. Water filled the cabin to her waist, then her chest. She pulled again, screamed once before the water reached her mouth, and then there was only the roar of the current and the terrible silence beneath it. Somewhere above the surface, a man named Edmund Ashbourne was riding home along the ridge road when he heard the crack of breaking stone carry over the wind. He had spent the afternoon at a tenant's farm, settling a dispute over flooded fields, and he was in no mood for further trouble. But the sound was wrong in a way that made him pull his horse to a stop and listen. There was no second crack, only the river, louder than it should have been, and beneath that, very faint, a woman's cry cut short. He did not think before he moved. He turned his horse from the ridge road down the steep bank toward the water, driving the animal harder than he ever had, until the ground leveled out at the river's edge, and he saw the wreckage of a carriage rolling in the current like a broken toy. "There," he said aloud to no one, and swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. The river at that stretch was neither wide nor gentle. It moved fast between narrow banks, dragging branches and stone dust, and now the carriage itself, toward a bend where the water dropped over rocks in a shallow but violent fall. Edmund had grown up along this river. He knew that bend, and he knew that whatever the current carried past it would not survive the rocks below. He ran along the bank, matching his pace to the drifting carriage, searching the churn of water for any sign of a person. For a moment he thought he had misheard the cry, that the wreck was empty, its passengers already lost or already safe somewhere upstream. Then he saw an arm break the surface near the carriage door, pale against the brown water, reaching for anything at all. Edmund did not stop to remove his coat. He went into the river from the bank at a run, and the cold of it struck him like a blow, driving the breath from his chest. He fought the current sideways rather than against it, the way his father had taught him as a boy. letting the river carry him toward the carriage instead of trying to outpace it. The carriage rolled again as he reached it, and for a terrible moment he lost sight of the arm entirely. He dove beneath the surface, opening his eyes to the brown darkness, and found her there, caught by her coat against the broken doorframe, her hair drifting like weed around her face, her eyes closed. He pulled at the fabric until it tore free, wrapped his arm across her chest, and kicked hard for the surface. When they broke into the air, she did not breathe. He turned them both toward the bank, fighting the pull of the current with everything he had left, and felt the rocks of the falls grow louder behind them with every stroke. The bank came up faster than he expected. He drove his feet into the mud beneath the shallows and half carried, half dragged her onto the grass, well clear of the water's reach. She lay still, too still. He turned her onto her side and struck her back once, twice, and on the third strike she coughed a great mouthful of river water and drew a ragged breath that seemed to tear through her whole body. Edmund knelt over her in the rain, soaked through, his chest heaving, and watched her eyes open for the first time. They were gray and confused and afraid, and they found his face and held there as though he were the only fixed point in a world that had come apart. "Who?" she said, but could not finish the question before her eyes rolled back and she went limp again in his arms. He gathered her up without hesitation, her weight slight against him, her coat heavy with river water, and looked back once at the wreck of the carriage as it finally reached the falls and broke apart on the rocks below. There had been a driver, he was almost certain. He searched the water with his eyes for as long as he dared, but saw nothing more than broken wood and a single horse struggling free downstream. There was no time to search further. The woman in his arms was cold as the grave and growing colder. He would send men back to the river at first light, he told himself, to search the banks properly and learn what could be learned. For now there was nothing more the dark and the storm would allow him to do for anyone but her. He looked down at her face, slack and pale in the rain, and felt a strange tightening in his chest that he had no name for and no time to examine. His own horse had followed the bank at a nervous distance, and he called it to him with a low whistle that it obeyed out of long habit rather than courage. He lifted her onto the saddle before him, wrapped his own soaked coat around her as some poor defense against the wind, and turned the horse toward home. Ashbourne House stood 2 miles inland, on high ground the river had never touched even in its worst years. Edmund rode harder than the storm allowed, one arm locked around the stranger in his coat, the other guiding the reins, and did not slow until the lights of his own hall came into view through the rain. Servants came running at the sound of his shout before he had even reached the door. He carried her inside himself, dripping river water across the marble floor, and laid her before the great hall fire that had not yet burned down for the night. "Send for the physician," he said, "and bring every blanket in this house." His housekeeper, a steady woman named Margaret Doyle who had served the family for 30 years, took one look at the stranger's blue lips and pale skin, and began issuing orders of her own before the Duke had finished speaking. Servants scattered in every direction. Edmund knelt beside the fire, still soaked through himself, and watched the rise and fall of the young woman's chest, as though he could will it to continue by watching alone. He did not know her name. He did not know where she had come from or where she had been going, only that the river had very nearly taken her, and that some instinct older than reason had refused to let it. He reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the pulse at her wrist, faint but steady, and allowed himself, for the first time since he had heard the crack of breaking stone, to believe that she might live. Outside, the storm had not eased. Somewhere along the swollen river, pieces of a shattered carriage were still finding their way over the falls, carrying with them whatever proof of identity or purpose the young woman had once possessed. Whoever she had been traveling to meet would have no word of what happened to her. Whoever she had been traveling to escape would have no way to follow. For the moment, in the firelight of Ashbourne House, she belonged to no story but this one. Edmund Ashbourne watched her breathe and waited, and did not yet know how completely his ordered life had already changed course, the way a river changes course when the old bridge finally gives way beneath it. Charlotte woke to warmth, which frightened her more than the cold had. For a moment she believed she had drowned after all, that this soft light and gentle heat was some quiet room beyond death. Then a log shifted in a fireplace nearby, sending a small crack of sound through the air, and she understood she was alive, and lying in a bed that was not her own, in a house she did not recognize. She sat up too quickly and the room tilted. A woman near the window turned at once, setting aside a basin of water, and came to the bedside with the brisk manner of someone who had tended the sick many times before. "Careful now," the woman said. "You have been through a great deal. My name is Margaret Doyle. I keep this house. You are safe here." "Where is here?" Charlotte asked. Her voice came out cracked and thin, as though the river had scraped it raw on its way through her. "Ashbourne House," Margaret said. "His Grace pulled you from the water himself 2 nights past. You have been asleep since, waking only enough to take a little broth, though I doubt you will remember it. 2 nights." Charlotte pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to gather the pieces of what had happened. The carriage, the crack of the bridge giving way, the water closing over her head faster than she could fight it. After that there was nothing but darkness, and now this room, warm and unfamiliar, with a stranger's kindness folded around her like the blankets on the bed. "My things," she said suddenly. "My bag, my letters. Was any of it recovered?" Margaret's face answered before her words did. "Nothing has washed up but splinters of wood," she said gently. "His Grace sent men along both banks yesterday morning. They found no trunk, no papers, nothing that might tell us who you are or where you were bound. I am sorry to say it plainly, but I think it best you know the truth of it rather than hope for what will not come." Charlotte sat very still, feeling the full weight of the loss settle over her. Every letter proving her identity, every document naming the arrangement her aunt had made, the small amount of money she had been permitted to bring, all of it gone, swallowed by the same river that had nearly swallowed her. She had arrived in this house with nothing but the clothes on her back, and even those had likely been cut away and burned as ruined. "And the driver?" she asked quietly, though she feared the answer. Margaret's silence was answer enough. "A search continues," she said at last. "But the current in that stretch shows little mercy, and it has been 2 days now." Charlotte closed her eyes. She had not known the driver's name, had barely spoken 3 words to him before the storm took the bridge, and yet the thought of him lost in that water settled over her like a stone. She thought of her aunt's cold letter, of the arrangement it demanded, and wondered distantly whether anyone would even think to search for her, or whether they would simply assume the arrangement had fallen through and move on to some other candidate for whatever future had been planned for her. A knock came at the door, firm and unhurried, and Margaret rose to answer it. Charlotte heard low voices in the corridor, and then the door opened wider, to admit a man she recognized at once, though she had only seen his face for a moment through water and rain. He was taller than she remembered, and drier, dressed now in dark clothes that fit him with the plain precision of a man who cared little for fashion and much for order. His hair was still faintly damp, as though he had only just finished dressing after his own recovery from the river. He stopped a respectful distance from the bed and studied her with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between relief and reserve. "You are awake," he said. "Good. I understand I owe you my life," Charlotte said. She tried to sit straighter, aware suddenly of how she must appear, pale and disheveled in a borrowed nightgown, in the presence of a man whose bearing suggested he was accustomed to rooms far grander than sickbeds. "You owe me nothing," he said. "Any man on that bank would have done the same." "Any man on that bank did not do the same," Charlotte said. "Only you did." Something flickered across his face at that, gone before she could name it. He inclined his head slightly, neither agreeing nor arguing, and gestured toward a chair near the bed as though asking permission to sit. Margaret excused herself quietly, leaving the 2 of them with the fire and the rain still tapping faintly against the window. "I am Edmund Ashbourne," he said, once he had seated himself. "This is my house, and you are welcome in it for as long as you require." "Charlotte Hale," she offered in return. "Though I confess I have very little left to prove it. My papers, my letters, everything was lost with the carriage." "Mrs. Doyle told me as much," he said. "It complicates matters, but it does not trouble me. A name given honestly is proof enough for my household." She studied him for a long moment, trying to understand what manner of man offered such trust to a stranger pulled half-drowned from his own river. There was nothing soft in his face, nothing that suggested easy sentiment, and yet his actions since the moment he had appeared through the water had been nothing but generous. "May I ask what you were doing on that ridge road in such weather?" she said. "It seems a strange place for a duke to be riding alone in a storm." "I had business with a tenant," he said. "A dispute over flooded fields that could not wait for fairer skies. I did not expect to find a carriage in the river when I rode home." "Nor did I expect to be in one," Charlotte said, and something in the dryness of her own voice surprised her. Grief and fear still sat heavy in her chest, but there was also, unexpectedly, a flicker of something like humor, and she saw it reflected for half a second in the corner of his mouth before he mastered it. "You have had a difficult 2 days," he said, rising. "I will not tire you further tonight. Mrs. Doyle will see that you have everything you need. Tomorrow, if you feel equal to it, we might discuss what is to be done, where you might have family who should be informed, and how best to see you safely return to them." Charlotte felt a small chill at those words that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. Return to them. returned to her aunt's cold letter and the arrangement waiting on the other side of it, as though the river had only delayed the inevitable rather than changed it. "Thank you," she said instead, because there was nothing else to say, and because gratitude, at least, was simple and true. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and looked back at her with an expression that lasted only a moment before he schooled it into something more careful. "I am glad you lived, Miss Hale," he said, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with the fire and the rain and the strange, unsettled feeling that the river had carried her not away from her troubles but directly into the path of a different one entirely. Before he left the room that first evening, he stopped once more, as if reconsidering something. "If it eases your mind," he said, "I have already sent riders to the nearest villages and posting inns, asking after any family expecting a young woman traveling this road. If your aunt sent word ahead of your arrival anywhere, we will find it. You need not carry the burden of finding your own way home while you are still too weak to stand without support." Charlotte felt an unexpected sting behind her eyes at the kindness of it, plain and practical as it was. "Thank you," she said again, and meant it more deeply than the words could carry. Later that night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, she lay watching the shifting light of the fire on the ceiling and turned the last days over in her mind. She thought of the letter from her aunt, folded now to nothing, dissolved somewhere along the riverbed with the rest of her belongings. Perhaps, she thought, that was not entirely a misfortune. The arrangement it described had never once mentioned her own wishes, only a name, a sum, and a date by which the matter was to be settled. She had been traveling toward a stranger, chosen by other people, for reasons that had nothing to do with her own happiness, and some small, guilty part of her wondered whether the river had done her an unintended kindness in taking that letter away before she could deliver herself into its terms. She did not share these thoughts with Margaret Doyle the next morning, though the older woman seemed to read something of them in her face regardless. "You have the look of a woman turning over a hard question," Margaret said, setting a tray of bread and tea beside the bed. "I will not pry, but I will say this house has held harder questions than most, and answered a good many of them honestly, in its own time." "What do you mean by that?" Charlotte asked. Margaret only smiled and busied herself with the curtains, letting in a pale wash of morning light. "His Grace is not a man who speaks his mind easily," she said at last, "but he is a man who acts it plainly enough, if you know to watch for it. Few guests in this house have ever received the attention you have these past days. I have served this family a long time, and I know the difference between duty and something more than duty, even when the man himself has not yet named it." Charlotte turned the words over long after Margaret had gone, uncertain what to make of them, and uncertain, too, why her heart had quickened so foolishly at the thought. Over the following days, Charlotte began to understand the shape of the household she had washed into. Ashbourne House ran with the quiet precision of a man who left little to chance, every servant moving with purpose, every room kept in careful order, and yet beneath that precision, she began to notice small signs of a life lived with less warmth than the fires in every hearth suggested. There were no portraits of a wife or children. There was no laughter carrying down the long corridors. Margaret Doyle, when pressed gently, would say only that His Grace had run this house alone since his father's passing some 6 years before, and that suited him well enough, or so he claimed. Charlotte's strength returned slowly, and with it, the ache of her losses. She had no money, no proof of who she was beyond her own word, and no way to write to her aunt without revealing exactly where she had ended up, which she found herself, to her own surprise, reluctant to do. Each day she told herself she would ask Edmund to help her send word home, and each day some small distraction or some small conversation with him over supper delayed the request another few hours. She began to notice things about him that she suspected few others were permitted to see. The way his composure slipped, briefly, when a letter arrived from a cousin pressing him about matters of inheritance he clearly wished to avoid. The way he softened, almost against his will, when speaking to the youngest of his stable hands, a boy no older than 12 who followed him about with obvious devotion. The careful, deliberate distance he kept from her at supper each evening, as though he were a man guarding something he did not entirely trust himself to protect. On the 5th evening, as the last of the storm finally cleared and stars appeared over the estate for the first time since her arrival, Charlotte found him alone on the terrace, looking out over the dark line of the river in the distance. "You still watch it," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Habit," he admitted. "I have watched that river every evening since I was a boy. It never occurred to me it might one day carry someone to my door." "Are you sorry that it did?" she asked, and immediately wished she had not, the question too bare, too close to something neither of them had spoken aloud. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still on the water. "No," he said finally, "I am not sorry at all." Charlotte said nothing more, but she felt the words settle into her chest with a warmth the fire inside the house had never quite managed. They stood together in silence for a while, the stars sharpening overhead as the last clouds cleared, and she found herself studying his profile in the dim light, the set of his jaw, the careful stillness he seemed to hold even when he thought no one was watching him closely. "May I ask you something?" she said at last. "Anything," he answered, and there was a small surprise in his own voice at how quickly the word had come. "Why did you go into the water yourself?" she asked. "You might have sent men from the house. You might have ridden for help instead. A duke does not usually risk his own life for a stranger's carriage." He considered the question longer than she expected, his eyes still fixed on the dark line of the river below. "I did not think of it as risk," he said finally. "I heard a cry cut short, and there was no time to weigh what was owed to my title against what was owed to a person drowning. Perhaps that says something foolish about me. Perhaps it says only that some decisions are not decisions at all, only reflexes a man cannot argue with even if he wanted to." "I am glad you did not argue with it," Charlotte said softly. "So am I," he answered, and for the first time since she had woken in his house he smiled, not the careful measured expression he wore at supper, but something unguarded and brief, gone almost as soon as it appeared, and yet she carried the memory of it with her long after she had returned to her room, and the fire had burned down to embers. She understood, with a small and frightening clarity, that whatever waited for her beyond Ashbourne House, some part of her had already begun to wish it might wait a little longer. A visitor arrived at Ashbourne House on the 7th day, and Charlotte knew from the sudden change in the household's rhythm that this was no ordinary caller. Servants moved faster. Margaret Doyle's mouth pressed into a thin line she had not worn before. Even the dogs in the yard seemed to sense something and kept close to the stable rather than roaming as they usually did. Charlotte was in the small sitting room reading when she heard the carriage on the drive, and she rose to look out the window before she could stop herself. A woman stepped down, elegant in deep green traveling clothes, her dark hair arranged with a precision that suggested hours of effort rather than natural gift. She surveyed the front of the house with the proprietary air of someone who considered it, at least in part, her own. "Who is that?" Charlotte asked when Margaret appeared a moment later with an armful of fresh linens. "Lady Beatrice Ashbourne," Margaret said, her tone carefully neutral. "His Grace's cousin. She visits perhaps twice a year, and always without warning." "Is that unusual?" Charlotte asked. Margaret's pause said more than her answer did. "She has certain hopes for this house," Margaret said finally. "Hopes His Grace has never encouraged, though that has not stopped her from holding them. I would advise caution, Miss Hale, though I suspect you would have arrived at that conclusion yourself soon enough." Charlotte spent the better part of an hour trying to occupy herself with her book before the summons came, though she read the same page perhaps a dozen times without absorbing a single word of it. She could hear voices drifting faintly from the drawing room below, one low and measured, the other quick and light, rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested neither speaker was entirely at ease. She recognized Edmund's voice in the lower register, though she could not make out his words, and found herself straining to catch some fragment of the conversation, despite knowing perfectly well that eavesdropping would serve her no purpose beyond feeding an anxiety already gnawing at her chest. When Margaret appeared at last to fetch her, the older woman's face carried a warning Charlotte did not need spoken aloud. "Best to keep your answers short," Margaret murmured as they walked together toward the drawing room. "Lady Beatrice has a gift for turning a simple sentence into an admission of guilt, whether or not any guilt exists to admit." "I have nothing to hide," Charlotte said, more to steady her own nerve than to correct the housekeeper. "That has rarely stopped a determined woman from finding something regardless," Margaret said, and gave Charlotte's hand a brief, bracing squeeze before opening the door and announcing her. Charlotte did not have long to wait before arriving at it. She was summoned to the drawing room within the hour and found Lady Beatrice already seated near the fire, a cup of tea untouched in her hand, studying Charlotte's approach with open, unhurried appraisal. "So you are the girl from the river," Beatrice said, before Charlotte had even finished her curtsy. "Edmund's letter mentioned you, though it told me very little. I confess I expected someone rather more dramatic. The way the servants speak of it, one would think you had been pulled from the jaws of a sea monster rather than a flooded crossing." "I am grateful for whatever His Grace chose to say," Charlotte answered evenly, "and gratitude does not require drama." "A careful answer," Beatrice said, setting down her cup with a small, precise click of porcelain against saucer. "You have manners, at least. That will serve you better here than you might think. Tell me, Miss Hale, where is your family?" Edmund's letter was vague on the matter, which I find curious for a man who is rarely vague about anything. "My family is not far from here. Charlotte said, choosing her words with care. I was traveling to them when the accident occurred. Unfortunately, my papers were lost with the carriage, so I have little to offer you beyond my own account. How convenient, Beatrice said, and though her tone remained light, the words landed with an edge Charlotte could not mistake. A young woman with no name that can be proven, no family that can be reached, washed quite literally onto my cousin's doorstep, and now residing under his roof for, what is it now, a week. You must forgive me if I find the whole arrangement somewhat remarkable. Charlotte felt heat rise in her face, though she kept her voice level. I did not choose to fall into that river, Lady Beatrice, nor did I choose whose land I would wash up on. I am grateful for his grace's kindness, and I intend to trouble his household no longer than necessary. See that you do not, Beatrice said, rising smoothly to her feet. Edmund has responsibilities to this family that extend well beyond a single evening's rescue, however heroic it may have looked from the riverbank. I would hate to see sentiment mistaken for something it is not. She swept from the room without waiting for a response, leaving Charlotte standing alone by the fire, her hands pressed together to keep them from shaking with a mixture of anger and something closer to fear. She had known, in some distant way, that her presence in this house was unusual, perhaps even improper by the standards of people like Lady Beatrice. Hearing it stated so plainly, however, was a different matter entirely. Charlotte spent the remainder of the afternoon in the garden, seeking whatever calm the fresh air could offer after the encounter. She walked the gravel paths slowly, past beds of late-season roses already beginning to fade, and tried to steady the racing thoughts Beatrice's visit had stirred loose. It was not only the accusation itself that troubled her, though the suggestion that she might be some manner of opportunist stung more sharply than she cared to admit. It was the deeper truth beneath it, the truth she had been avoiding since the night on the terrace when Edmund had told her, quietly, that he was not sorry the river had brought her to his door. She did not know what she was to this household, this family, this man who had pulled her from the water with his own hands. She had arrived with nothing, and every day that passed made the thought of leaving with nothing feel less like relief and more like loss. She found Edmund near the stables as the light began to fade, speaking with the young stable boy she had noticed following him about on her earlier walks through the grounds. He dismissed the boy gently as she approached, and turned to her with an expression that seemed to search her face for some sign of how the afternoon's conversation had gone. Your cousin is very direct, Charlotte said, before he could ask. She has always been so, he answered. It is not entirely a fault. She says plainly what others only imply, which I have found useful more often than not, even when the plainness is unwelcome. And is it unwelcome now? Charlotte asked. He was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the sun sink behind the tree line. Some of it, he admitted finally, not all. That evening at supper, the tension in the dining room was thick enough to taste. Beatrice held court over most of the conversation, directing pointed questions toward Charlotte about her supposed family, her upbringing, her connections, each one delivered with a smile that did nothing to soften its purpose. Charlotte answered as carefully as she could, aware of Edmund watching the exchange from the head of the table with an expression that grew steadily more clipped as the meal progressed. You are remarkably reserved about your own history, Beatrice observed after Charlotte had once again deflected a question about her father's occupation. One might almost think you had something to hide. I have told you what I am able to tell you, Charlotte said. The rest was lost in the river along with everything else I owned. How fortunate, then, that you yourself were not lost along with it, Beatrice said, and though the words might have passed as simple observation from anyone else, the flat coldness beneath them was unmistakable. That is enough, Edmund said, setting down his glass with more force than the moment strictly required. Miss Hale has endured a great deal these past days. I did not invite you to this table to interrogate her. Beatrice's eyebrows rose, delicate and deliberate. I only wonder what our uncle would say, she replied, if he could see how much has changed in this house in so short a time. He was always concerned that you would let sentiment override sense, Edmund. It seems his concern was not misplaced. My affairs are my own to manage, Edmund said, his voice quiet now but carrying an edge Charlotte had not heard from him before, as they have been since his passing. I would ask you to remember that, cousin, and to extend Miss Hale the same courtesy any guest under this roof deserves. The rest of the meal passed in strained silence, Beatrice's sharp glances the only sound beyond the clink of cutlery. When at last the plates were cleared, Charlotte excused herself as quickly as manners allowed and retreated to her room, her heart still pounding from the exchange. She had barely settled by the window when a soft knock came at her door. Edmund stood in the corridor when she opened it, his expression a mixture of apology and something harder to name. I owe you an apology for my cousin's manner tonight. he said. She does not always temper her curiosity with kindness. She is not wrong to be curious, Charlotte said. I am a stranger in your house with no proof of anything I claim to be. I would wonder the same, in her position. There is a difference between wondering and accusing, Edmund said. She crossed that line tonight, and I will not have it repeated at my table. Charlotte studied him for a moment, uncertain how to answer the quiet intensity in his voice. Why does it matter so much to you? She asked finally. My comfort in this house is not worth a quarrel with your own family. Something shifted in his face at that, some careful wall lowering by a fraction before he caught himself. It matters, he said, because you did not ask to be brought into my household, and yet you have borne every indignity of it with more grace than most people born to it would manage. That deserves protection, whatever my cousin believes about sentiment and sense. Charlotte felt her breath catch at the words, at the low, careful way he had said them, as though each one had cost him something to admit aloud. Thank you, she said softly, because it was, once again, the only true thing she could think to say. He held her gaze a moment longer than courtesy required, then inclined his head and bid her good night, leaving her alone with the fire and a heart that refused to settle into anything like calm. Later that night, unable to settle, Charlotte slipped down to the kitchen for a cup of warm milk, hoping the walk might tire her enough to sleep. She found Margaret still awake at the long wooden table, mending a torn hem by candlelight, and the older woman waved her toward the bench across from her without pausing her needle. You are troubled, Margaret observed, not unkindly. Lady Beatrice has a way of making a person doubt themselves, Charlotte admitted, sitting down heavily. Margaret set down her needle for a moment, studying Charlotte with the frank, unhurried gaze of a woman who had raised her share of nieces and had little patience left for pretense. She is not entirely wrong to be watchful, Margaret said. She has spent years guarding this family from fortune hunters and false claims, and not always without cause, but she is wrong about you, and I suspect she knows it better than she lets on. A fortune hunter does not spend her recovery asking after the fate of a driver she barely knew, or refusing every offer of fine clothing on the grounds that it is more than she has any right to accept. I have watched you closely these past days, Miss Hale, and I have seen nothing in you but honest gratitude and honest grief. Charlotte felt her throat tighten unexpectedly at the kindness of the words. Thank you, she managed. Margaret returned to her mending with a small, satisfied nod, as though the matter were settled and needed no further discussion. Get some rest, she said. Tomorrow will bring its own trials without you borrowing tonight's as well. Charlotte took the advice as best she could, though sleep came slowly, her mind circling again and again through the day's conversations, Beatrice's sharp questions, Edmund's quiet defense of her at the table, the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had settled into her chest and refused to leave no matter how firmly she reminded herself that she had no right to it. She was a guest in this house, nothing more, with no name that could be proven and no family that could be reached. Whatever she felt growing between herself and the man who had saved her life was, she told herself sternly, a debt of gratitude and nothing else. She almost believed it by the time exhaustion finally pulled her under. Lady Beatrice remained at Ashbourne House for 3 more days, and each of them brought some fresh test of Charlotte's patience. She found herself the subject of pointed remarks at breakfast, careful silences that fell whenever she entered a room, and once, a conversation between Beatrice and the housekeeper that stopped abruptly the moment Charlotte's footsteps were heard in the corridor. On the final evening of the visit, Charlotte came upon Beatrice alone in the library, standing before a portrait of a stern, unsmiling man Charlotte did not recognize. My uncle, Beatrice said without turning, sensing her presence. Edmund's father. He built this house into what it is, and he did not do it by indulging every passing sentiment that crossed his path. I imagine you think me cruel, Miss Hale, for speaking plainly about what you represent. I think you are protecting something you care about, Charlotte said carefully. I cannot fault you for that, even if I do not care for the manner of it. Beatrice finally turned, studying her with an expression that had, for the first time, lost some of its sharp edge. You are more perceptive than I expected, she admitted. Very well. I will speak plainly, since you seem capable of hearing it without flinching. Edmund has spent 6 years since his father's death guarding this family's position with a discipline that has cost him a great deal, including, I suspect, any real chance at happiness. I have watched him deny himself every comfort in the name of duty. And now, in the space of a single week, I watch him look at a woman he pulled from a river with an expression I have not seen on his face in all those 6 years. I do not know whether to be glad of it or afraid for him. Charlotte did not know how to answer that, and so she said nothing at all, though the words lodged themselves deep in her chest, and stayed there long after Beatrice had swept from the room the following morning, her carriage disappearing down the long drive without so much as a backward glance. Edmund watched from the front steps until the carriage was well out of sight, and then turned to find Charlotte standing quietly beside him, having come out to witness the departure herself. "I am sorry for the trouble she caused you," he said. "She caused no trouble I could not manage," Charlotte said, "though I confess I am glad of the quiet that follows." He almost smiled at that, the ghost of the expression she had seen on the terrace days before. "As am I," he admitted, and for a long moment they stood together on the steps in comfortable silence, watching the dust of the departed carriage settle slowly over the empty drive, neither of them quite ready to be the first to go back inside. The letter arrived on a gray morning nearly 3 weeks after the accident, carried by a rider Charlotte did not recognize, dressed in livery she recognized even less. She was in the garden when Margaret came hurrying out to find her, an odd, careful expression on her face that made Charlotte's stomach tighten before a single word was spoken. "There is a gentleman at the door," Margaret said. "He asked for you by name." She set down the small trowel she had been using to tend the roses and wiped her hands on her apron, trying to steady the sudden unease rising in her chest. In the weeks since the accident she had allowed herself, cautiously, to believe that the world beyond Ashbourne House had somehow lost track of her entirely, that the river had erased not only her belongings but the arrangement waiting for her on the other side of the crossing. It had been a foolish hope, she realized now, walking quickly toward the house behind Margaret's hurried steps. Debts did not dissolve simply because the person meant to pay them had nearly drowned. Arrangements made by cold calculation rarely cared for storms or broken bridges. Charlotte's first thought was that it must be some mistake, since no one beyond Ashbourne House itself knew where she was. Her second thought, cold and immediate, was her aunt's letter, folded and lost in the river weeks ago, and the arrangement it had described. She followed Margaret inside with her heart pounding and found a man waiting in the front hall, tall and narrow, dressed in the kind of fine clothes that spoke more of borrowed money than earned wealth. "Miss Hale," he said, sweeping into a bow that felt somehow mocking despite its correctness. "What a relief to finally locate you. Your aunt has been beside herself with worry. I am Gerald Fenwick." Charlotte recognized the name at once, though she had never met the man attached to it. Her aunt's letter had named him, briefly, as the arrangement itself, the husband selected without her knowledge or consent. Seeing him now, in the flesh, was worse than any imagining she had constructed in the weeks since. "Mr. Fenwick," she said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage, "I confess I did not expect to see you here. Nor did I expect to spend 3 weeks tracing a missing carriage across half the county," he said, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "When word reached your aunt that the crossing at Marwood had failed during the storm, and that no trace of you could be found, she feared the worst. It was only through considerable effort, and no small expense, that I learned you had been pulled from the river and brought to this house." Charlotte felt the walls of the hall seem to close in around her. "I am grateful for your concern," she said carefully, though gratitude was the furthest thing from what she felt. "Your aunt sent me to collect you," Fenwick continued, his eyes sweeping the hall with an appraising interest that made Charlotte's skin crawl. "The arrangement between our families stands regardless of this unfortunate delay. I have a carriage waiting, and rooms prepared. We can be married within the fortnight, once matters are properly settled." "I have no intention of leaving with you," Charlotte said, before she could stop herself. Fenwick's smile thinned but did not disappear. "That is not entirely your decision to make, Miss Hale. Your aunt has legal authority over your affairs until such time as the marriage is complete. I am afraid your preferences, however strongly held, do not alter the terms of the agreement." It was at that moment that Edmund appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the sound of raised voices, and descended with a controlled, deliberate calm that nonetheless carried an unmistakable edge of warning. "Is there a difficulty?" he asked, coming to stand beside Charlotte with a presence that seemed to fill the hall entirely. "And you are?" Fenwick asked, his gaze flicking over Edmund's clothing, and bearing with the same appraising interest he had turned on the house itself, arriving quickly enough at the correct, uneasy conclusion. "This is the Duke of Ashbourne," Charlotte said. "He is the one who saved my life when the bridge at Marwood gave way." Fenwick's bow this time carried considerably more genuine deference. "Your Grace," he said, "forgive the intrusion. I am here on behalf of Miss Hale's aunt, to collect her and see the family's arrangement properly concluded. I understand the household owes you a great debt for her rescue, and I assure you that debt will be remembered." "I require no remembrance," Edmund said, his voice cool. "Miss Hale is a guest in my house, free to come and go as she chooses, If she does not wish to accompany you, then the matter is settled." "The matter," Fenwick said, his patience visibly fraying, "is not so simple as your grace suggests. Miss Hale's aunt holds legal guardianship over her affairs. This is not a question of preference. It is a question of law." Charlotte felt the room tilt beneath her, the old fear from her aunt's letter rising up fresh and sharp. She looked to Edmund, uncertain what protection he could truly offer against something as immovable as law, and found him watching Fenwick with an expression of cold, calculating patience that gave her, despite everything, a small measure of hope. "Then perhaps," Edmund said slowly, "we ought to examine the precise terms of that guardianship, and the precise terms of this arrangement you speak of, before anyone is collected and carried anywhere. I would not want to see a legal matter settled improperly, Mr. Fenwick, particularly not under my own roof." Fenwick's composure slipped for the first time since his arrival. "That will not be necessary, Your Grace," he said. "The matter is quite straightforward." "If it is straightforward," Edmund said, "then you will have no objection to my solicitor reviewing the documents before Miss Hale leaves this house. I trust you have brought them with you." A long silence stretched between the two men, and Charlotte watched Fenwick's face carefully, searching for some sign of the truth beneath his composure. She saw it at last, a flicker of something uncertain, almost desperate, quickly smoothed over, but not quickly enough to escape her notice. "The documents are with your aunt, at present," Fenwick said finally. "I had not anticipated needing to produce them here." "Then I would suggest," Edmund said, his voice never rising above its careful, controlled register, "that you return to collect them, and return again when you are prepared to have this matter examined properly. Until then, Miss Hale remains under my protection, and I would ask that you not trouble this household further without proper cause." Fenwick's jaw tightened, and for a moment Charlotte feared he might press the matter further, might insist on some right he did not truly possess. Instead, he offered a stiff, shallow bow, his eyes flicking once more to Charlotte with a coldness that made her grateful for Edmund's presence beside her. "This is not finished, Miss Hale," he said. "Your aunt will not be pleased to learn of this delay, and I doubt the Duke's protection extends indefinitely to matters that are not, strictly speaking, his own to protect." He left without further word, his carriage rattling away down the long drive far faster than dignity strictly required, and Charlotte let out a breath she had not realized she was holding the moment the front door closed behind him. Margaret appeared at her side almost at once, having clearly been listening from some discreet corner of the hall, her expression a careful mixture of relief and lingering worry. "That man had the look of someone accustomed to getting his own way," she said quietly. "I am glad his grace did not let him have it today." "Today," Charlotte repeated, the words settling uneasily in her chest. "You think he will return?" Margaret's silence was answer enough, and Charlotte felt the small measure of relief she had gathered begin to drain away again, replaced by the familiar, exhausting weight of dread. She had thought, for one foolish moment, that Edmund's intervention had ended the matter entirely. She understood now, watching the empty drive where Fenwick's carriage had disappeared, that it had only delayed it, the way the storm had only delayed the arrangement rather than erasing it, carrying her instead into a different kind of danger she had not yet learned to name. "Are you well?" Edmund asked, turning to her with a concern that had replaced the cold calculation of moments before. "I do not know," Charlotte admitted, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. "I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the river had taken that arrangement along with everything else I lost. It seems some debts follow a person regardless of how far the current carries them." Edmund studied her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she could not quite name. "Come," he said finally, "sit, and tell me everything about this arrangement, from the beginning. If there is a way to free you from it honestly, I intend to find it." They sat together in the library as the afternoon light faded, and Charlotte told him everything: her father's death 3 years before, the debts he had left unknowingly behind him, her aunt's cold calculation in matching her to Fenwick's family in exchange for the settlement of those debts, the letter that had summoned her to the crossing at Marlwood in the first place. Edmund listened without interrupting, his expression growing steadily harder as the story unfolded, until at last she finished, and the library fell silent but for the crackle of the fire. "Your father's debts are not your burden to carry," he said finally. "Whatever agreement your aunt made, it was made without your consent, and I do not believe any court in this country would uphold a marriage contracted under such terms, particularly not to a man like Fenwick, whose interest in you seems considerably more focused on whatever settlement your aunt has promised him than on you yourself." "You cannot know that for certain," Charlotte said. "I know enough," Edmund said, "and I intend to know more. I will write to my own solicitor tomorrow, and we will see this arrangement examined properly, as I told Fenwick we would." Whatever the outcome, you will not be forced into a marriage you do not want, not while you remain under my roof." Charlotte looked at him across the firelight, at the quiet, steady determination in his face, and felt something in her chest loosen, that had been tight with fear since the moment Fenwick had spoken her name in the front hall. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why do this for me? I am not your responsibility, whatever the river decided that night." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Perhaps," he said finally, "I no longer wish to think of it as a matter of responsibility at all." That night, Charlotte lay awake long after the fire in her room had burned to embers, turning Edmund's words over in her mind. "Perhaps I no longer wish to think of it as a matter of responsibility at all." She had heard the meaning beneath them clearly enough, and the knowledge frightened her nearly as much as Fenwick's visit had. She had arrived at Ashbourne House with nothing, a stranger pulled from a river, and in the space of a few short weeks, had allowed herself to hope for things she had no right to hope for. A home, a future, a man who looked at her as though she were something more than a debt to be settled or a name to be traded. She rose before dawn, unable to bear the stillness of her own thoughts any longer, and found the house already stirring, servants moving quietly through the corridors preparing for the day ahead. She made her way to the small breakfast room overlooking the eastern gardens, hoping the early light might settle her nerves before she had to face Edmund again, and found him already there, a letter half written on the table before him, his expression drawn with the particular exhaustion of a man who had slept little himself. "You are awake early," he said, rising as she entered. "I could not sleep," she admitted. "Fenwick's visit sits heavier on me than I expected." He gestured for her to sit, and poured her tea himself rather than summoning a servant, a small gesture that struck her as more intimate than it perhaps should have. "I have been writing to my solicitor since before first light," he said. "I want the matter of your father's debts, and whatever claim your aunt believes she holds over you, examined thoroughly and quickly. Fenwick did not strike me as a man who abandons a bargain easily, particularly not one that promises to settle debts he seems eager to see resolved." "You believe he has debts of his own?" Charlotte asked. "I would wager on it," Edmund said. "A man secure in his own fortune does not travel 3 weeks tracing a missing bride through half the county himself. He would have sent an agent, and waited comfortably at home for the matter to resolve. His urgency tells me something about his circumstances that your aunt may not have shared with you." Charlotte considered this, turning her teacup slowly in her hands. "It would explain a great deal," she said finally. "My aunt was always vague about the particulars of the arrangement, only that it would settle my father's debts and secure my future. I assumed the securing was meant for my benefit. I begin to wonder now whether it was meant for someone else's entirely." "Whatever the truth of it," Edmund said, his voice firm, "I do not intend to let you be traded like a settlement on someone else's ledger. Whatever it costs, in solicitors or in patience, I will see this resolved properly, and on terms that consider what you actually want, rather than what is convenient for your aunt or profitable for Mr. Fenwick." Charlotte looked at him across the small table, the early light catching the tired determination in his face, and felt something in her chest settle into place that had been unsteady since the moment she woke in his house weeks before. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt insufficient for the weight of what he was offering her, and she suspected, from the small, careful smile he gave in return, that he understood the insufficiency as well as she did, and did not mind it in the least. The solicitor's reply arrived 9 days later, and its contents were worse than either Charlotte or Edmund had hoped. The guardianship her aunt held was valid under the law, drawn up properly after her father's death, and would remain in force until Charlotte married or reached an age still some years distant. Worse still, the debts her father had left behind were substantial enough that a court, examining the matter purely on its financial terms, might well find the arrangement with Fenwick reasonable, however little regard it paid to Charlotte's own wishes. Charlotte had spent the 9 days waiting for the solicitor's reply in a state of restless suspension, trying to occupy her hands with small tasks about the house, while her mind circled endlessly around the same worn path of fear and half-formed hope. She had helped Margaret with the mending, walked the garden paths until she knew every stone by heart, even attempted, with mixed success, to assist the cook with the household accounts, anything to keep herself from sitting idle with nothing but her own anxious thoughts for company. Edmund had been little better, she noticed, disappearing for long hours into correspondence with his solicitor, emerging each evening with the same carefully neutral expression that told her nothing had yet been resolved. When the letter finally arrived, carried by a rider who had clearly pushed his horse hard to make the delivery before nightfall, Charlotte felt her whole body go still, with a mixture of relief that the waiting had ended, and dread at what the answer might contain. Edmund broke the seal himself in the front hall, reading in silence while she watched his face for any sign of what the words held. And when he finally looked up, the grim set of his jaw told her everything before he spoke a single word of explanation. She read the letter twice in the library, Edmund watching her face carefully from across the desk, and felt the small, fragile hope she had been nursing these past days begin to crumble. "There must be something more to be done," she said, though her voice carried less conviction than she wanted it to. "There is," Edmund said, "though I confess it is not a solution I offer lightly, nor one I would ask you to accept without understanding fully what it requires." Charlotte set the letter down and looked at him, something in his careful tone warning her that whatever came next would change the shape of everything between them. "Your guardianship transfers upon marriage," he said slowly. "If you were married, to anyone your aunt did not have cause to object to, before Fenwick's claim could be pressed further, the arrangement she has made with him would become void entirely. There would be nothing left for either of them to enforce." Charlotte's breath caught. "You are suggesting I marry someone else," she said, "immediately, before Fenwick can act." "I am suggesting," Edmund said, his voice steady despite what Charlotte now recognized as real nervousness beneath it, "that you marry me." The words hung in the quiet library for a long moment, and Charlotte found she could not speak at all, her mind racing through a dozen objections and a dozen hopes all at once, tangled too tightly together to separate. "I do not offer this lightly," Edmund continued, when her silence stretched too long for him to bear it. "I know it is sudden, and I know the circumstances are not what any woman dreams of when she imagines her own marriage. I would understand entirely if you refused. But it would end Fenwick's claim immediately and completely, and it would place you beyond your aunt's reach for good, regardless of what debts remain unpaid." "And if I refuse?" Charlotte asked quietly. "What then?" "Then I will continue fighting the matter through the courts, for as long as it takes," he said. "I would not abandon you to Fenwick regardless of your answer today, but I will not pretend the courts move quickly, or that Fenwick will simply wait patiently while they do." Charlotte rose and walked to the window, needing the distance to think clearly, aware of Edmund's eyes following her but not pressing her for an answer. She thought of the weeks since the accident, the quiet warmth of this house, the steady, careful kindness of the man now offering her his name, as a shield against a danger she had not asked to be caught in. She thought, too, of Lady Beatrice's words in the library weeks before, about a man who had denied himself every comfort in the name of duty, and wondered whether this offer was born of that same discipline, an obligation dressed as rescue, rather than anything closer to what she had begun, foolishly perhaps, to hope for. "Is this only to save me from Fenwick?" she asked, still facing the window. "Or is there some part of you that wants this for reasons that have nothing to do with rescue at all?" The silence behind her stretched long enough that she nearly turned to look at him, uncertain whether her question had been too bold, too revealing of her own feelings to be safely asked. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the careful, measured quality it usually carried, replaced by something rawer than she had heard from him before. "I have told myself for weeks that this is only about protecting you," he said. "I have told myself the same thing every evening I found some excuse to seek you out on the terrace. Every morning I found myself listening for your voice before I had even finished dressing. Every time my cousin accused me of sentiment, and I denied it more forcefully than the accusation deserved. I am no longer certain I believe myself, Charlotte. I think I have wanted this, wanted you, for longer than I have been willing to admit, and Fenwick's arrival has only forced me to say aloud what I should have said days ago, without the excuse of danger to hide behind." Charlotte turned to face him then, her heart pounding, searching his face for any sign that his words were spoken from obligation rather than truth, and finding none. There was only the same quiet, unguarded honesty she had glimpsed on the terrace weeks before, stripped now of all its careful restraint. "I do not want to be married only to be saved," she said softly. "I have spent my whole life being arranged, traded, decided for by other people. If I marry you, I want it to be because you want me, not because it is the fastest way to close a door Fenwick is trying to force open." "I want you," Edmund said, without hesitation, without the smallest trace of doubt. "I wanted you the moment you woke in that bed and looked at me as though I were the only fixed point in a world that had come apart. I have wanted you every day since, through every careful distance I forced between us at supper, every argument I made to myself about duty and propriety, and the difference between gratitude and something deeper. Fenwick's arrival did not create this feeling, Charlotte. It only made it impossible for me to keep pretending it did not exist." Charlotte crossed the room to him, her earlier caution dissolving beneath the plain, unguarded truth in his voice, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all. the library silent but for the crackle of the fire and the sound of their own uneven breathing. "Then yes," she said finally. "Yes, I will marry you. Not to escape Fenwick, though I will not pretend that danger plays no part in the timing of it, but because I have wanted this too, longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself." The relief and joy that broke across his face in that moment was unlike anything she had seen from him before, every careful restraint finally, completely gone, and when he reached for her hand she let him take it without hesitation, her fingers curling into his as though they had always belonged there. "We will need to move quickly," he said, once some measure of composure had returned to them both. "A special license, arranged through the bishop, could see us married within days rather than weeks. It will invite talk, I will not pretend otherwise. Society does not look kindly on hasty marriages, and there will be those who assume the worst of both our reasons." "Let them assume what they like," Charlotte said. "I have spent enough of my life arranging myself around other people's opinions. I find I have very little patience left for it now." Edmund's answering smile was the widest she had seen from him yet, and he lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture that felt, for the first time, entirely unguarded, and entirely his own choice rather than any careful calculation of duty. The following days passed in a blur of preparation, the special license secured, the small local chapel readied for a ceremony far quieter, and far sooner than either of them had ever imagined for themselves. Margaret Doyle wept openly when told the news, declaring it the finest thing to happen in this house in all her 30 years of service, and threw herself into the preparations with an energy that left half the household breathless trying to keep pace with her. There was little time for a proper wedding gown, but Margaret produced, from some corner of the house Charlotte had never seen, a length of pale blue silk that had belonged to Edmund's mother, carefully preserved and never used, and set 2 of the younger maids to work altering it through 2 long nights by candlelight. Charlotte protested that it was too fine a thing to rush into service on her account, but Margaret would hear none of it, insisting that nothing in the house would give her greater satisfaction than seeing that particular silk finally worn by a bride who deserved it. Edmund, for his part, seemed to grow quieter as the wedding day approached, though Charlotte came to understand it was not doubt that silenced him but a kind of careful disbelief, as though he feared examining his own happiness too closely might cause it to dissolve like mist over the river at dawn. She found him one evening standing before the same portrait of his father that Lady Beatrice had studied weeks before, and came to stand quietly beside him rather than interrupting his thoughts. He would have disapproved of this, Edmund said finally, without turning. A hasty marriage, no fortune, no connections beyond what you can prove with your own word. He built this family's position on caution and calculation, and I am about to undo a portion of it in the space of a single week. Do you regret it? Charlotte asked, though she kept her voice light, unwilling to let real fear creep into the question. Not for one moment, Edmund said, and finally turned to look at her, his expression settling into something steadier than she had seen from him in days. I think, if he could see past his own caution, he would understand that some decisions are not calculations at all. I learned that much the night I went into the river after you, and I have not forgotten the lesson since. Word of the sudden marriage reached beyond Ashbourne House faster than either of them expected, and on the third day, a letter arrived from Charlotte's aunt, sharp and furious, threatening legal challenge and social ruin in equal measure. Edmund read it once, set it aside without visible concern, and assured Charlotte that his solicitor was already prepared to answer any challenge her aunt cared to raise, and that a duke's marriage, once properly and legally contracted, was not easily undone by an aunt's displeasure, however loudly voiced. Fenwick himself sent no letter at all, though word reached them through a mutual acquaintance that he had already begun making inquiries elsewhere, his interest in Charlotte apparently no deeper than the settlement her aunt had promised him, exactly as Edmund had suspected from the beginning. Charlotte felt a strange, distant pity for whichever woman Fenwick's attentions eventually landed upon, though the feeling was quickly overtaken by relief that she herself would never learn the answer firsthand. She thought, too, of her aunt's furious letter, and found that its anger troubled her far less than she might once have expected. There had been a time, not so many weeks before, when her aunt's approval had felt like the only solid ground beneath her feet, the only measure of whether she had lived her life correctly. That ground had shifted entirely since the night the river took the carriage, and she found she did not miss its old, familiar weight nearly as much as she had feared she would. Lady Beatrice, to Charlotte's genuine surprise, sent a brief letter of her own 2 days before the wedding, its tone considerably softer than anything she had spoken aloud during her visit weeks earlier. She wrote only that she had been wrong to doubt Charlotte's character, that she had watched enough of the household's account of the intervening weeks, To understand her earlier suspicions had done Charlotte a disservice, and that she wished them both happiness, however unconventional its arrival. Charlotte read the letter twice, moved more than she expected by the admission, and resolved to answer it kindly once the wedding itself was behind them. The night before the ceremony, Margaret helped Charlotte into bed with the same careful attention she had shown since the first night of her recovery, tucking the blankets with brisk efficiency before pausing at the door. "You have come a long way from the girl I pulled dry clothes onto that first terrible night," Margaret said, a fondness in her voice that Charlotte had come to treasure over the weeks of her recovery. "I do not think I have ever seen His Grace happier, nor more himself, than he has been since you came into this house." "I hope I can be worthy of that happiness," Charlotte said quietly. "You already are," Margaret said, and closed the door softly behind her, leaving Charlotte alone with the fire and a heart too full of hope to allow much room for sleep. On the evening before the wedding, Charlotte found Edmund once more on the terrace, watching the dark line of the river in the distance, and came to stand beside him as she had done so many times in the weeks since her arrival. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked, though she asked it lightly, without real fear behind the words. "Only one," he said, turning to look at her with an expression softer than she had ever seen him wear. "I find myself wishing we had met under gentler circumstances, so that you might have had the courtship you deserved, rather than a rescue and a rushed license and a marriage arranged to outrun a man like Fenwick." Charlotte considered this for a moment, watching the same dark water that had so nearly taken her life, and found, to her own surprise, that she felt no regret at all for the strange, sudden path that had brought her here. "I do not think I would trade it," she said finally. "The river took everything I owned that night, my papers, my belongings, even the arrangement my aunt had made for me, but it gave me this in return, and I find I would not trade this for any gentler beginning imaginable." Edmund reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and together they watched the river in silence, the same current that had so nearly ended everything now carrying them quietly toward whatever came next. The chapel bells were still ringing when the first sign of trouble arrived, though Charlotte did not learn of it until well after the ceremony itself had concluded. She stood at the altar in the pale blue silk Margaret's girls had labored over through 2 long nights, her hand steady in Edmund's as the vows were spoken, and felt none of the fear that had haunted her these past weeks, only a quiet, settled certainty that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. It was only as the small gathering of guests spilled out onto the chapel steps that Margaret drew Edmund aside, her expression tight with a worry she was clearly trying to keep from disturbing the day's happiness. Charlotte caught only fragments of the exchange, a rider from the county seat, papers filed, an urgent matter requiring the Duke's immediate attention, but the shift in Edmund's posture told her the news was serious long before he returned to her side to explain it. "Your aunt has filed a formal challenge," he said quietly, drawing her a little apart from the other guests. "She claims the marriage was contracted under duress, and that her guardianship was violated before proper legal notice could be given. A magistrate has agreed to hear the matter tomorrow morning." "Can she succeed?" Charlotte asked, the joy of the morning suddenly cold in her chest. "I do not believe so," Edmund said, though his voice carried a tension she had not heard from him since Fenwick's first visit. "But I will not pretend the challenge is without teeth. If the magistrate finds any irregularity in how quickly the license was secured, or any suggestion that you were coerced rather than willing, the marriage could be set aside entirely, and you would be returned to your aunt's guardianship regardless of what either of us wants." Charlotte felt the ground shift beneath her once again, the same familiar fear she had hoped, foolishly, to have left behind on her wedding day. That fear was old and worn now, though, sharpened by weeks of practice, and she found she could face it with far steadier hands than she once might have. "Then we will go before the magistrate together," she said, "and tell him the truth, that I was not coerced, that I chose this freely, and would choose it again 100 times over, whatever my aunt claims to believe." Edmund's expression softened at the certainty in her voice, and he pressed her hand gently before answering. "That is precisely what I intend to do," he said, "though I confess I would spare you the ordeal if I could." "I do not wish to be spared it," Charlotte said. "I have spent enough of my life having decisions made for me and around me, without my voice in the matter. If a magistrate is to decide my future, he will hear it from me directly, not only from lawyers arguing on my behalf." Charlotte forced herself to smile through the remainder of the morning celebrations, though her mind kept circling back to the words Margaret had exchanged with Edmund near the chapel steps. She caught snatches of conversation among the guests as well, whispered speculation about the speed of the marriage and what it might suggest, and understood, with a small, sinking clarity, that her aunt's challenge would not be the only voice raised in doubt about the legitimacy of what she and Edmund had built together. Society, it seemed, was every bit as quick to judge as Lady Beatrice had once warned her it would be, and she wondered, briefly, whether the happiness of the morning had already been spoiled beyond repair before the day had even properly begun. Edmund seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts, for he found a moment amid the well-wishes to draw her aside near the garden entrance, away from the press of guests. "Do not let their whispers steal this day from you," he said quietly. "Whatever is said in drawing rooms across the county tomorrow, nothing changes the truth of what happened in that chapel this morning, or what I feel for you, or what you chose freely for yourself. I am trying not to let it," Charlotte admitted. "But I confess the ease with which people assume the worst still surprises me, even after everything Lady Beatrice warned me to expect. People will always find it easier to imagine scandal than to imagine simple happiness," Edmund said. "It asks less of them. I have long since stopped measuring my own choices against what is easiest for other people to imagine." The wedding breakfast that followed carried an undercurrent of anxiety beneath its careful cheer, though Margaret and the household staff did their best to preserve what joy they could for the newly married couple. Charlotte found herself grateful for the distraction of well wishes and toasts, even as her mind kept circling back to the hearing awaiting them the following morning, and the very real possibility that everything gained these past weeks might yet be stripped away by a magistrate who had never met either of them, and cared nothing for the truth of their feelings. That evening, as the last of the guests departed and the house settled into quiet, Edmund found her once more on the terrace, watching the dark line of the river that had started everything. "You are frightened," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I am," she admitted. "Not of the river this time, but of tomorrow. I have only just begun to believe I might keep this happiness, and now I must fight to hold on to it before I have even had the chance to grow accustomed to having it at all." "Whatever happens tomorrow," Edmund said, taking her hand in both of his, "you are my wife now. In every way the law recognizes, and every way that matters beyond the law as well. I will fight this challenge with everything I have, and I do not intend to lose you to a magistrate any more than I intended to lose you to that river weeks ago." Sleep came slowly that night, despite the exhaustion of the day, and Charlotte woke well before dawn to find Edmund already awake beside her, staring at the ceiling with the same careful, unreadable expression she remembered from their first conversation weeks before. "You are thinking of the hearing," she said softly. "I am thinking of every way it might go wrong," he admitted. "I have faced difficult negotiations before, tenant disputes, matters of inheritance, even a challenge to my own title from a distant cousin some years back. I do not recall feeling this unsettled by any of them." "Because none of them threatened to take away something you actually wanted," Charlotte said, understanding the truth of it even as she spoke it aloud. Edmund turned to look at her, something softening in his face despite the tension still evident in his shoulders. "No," he agreed, "none of them did." They rose together as the first gray light crept over the horizon, dressing in careful, formal clothes suited to the seriousness of the day ahead, and rode to the county seat in a silence that carried more determination than fear. Charlotte watched the countryside pass beyond the carriage window, the same roads she had traveled weeks before toward a very different fate, and found a strange comfort in how much had changed since that storm-swept journey, even as the outcome of today's hearing remained entirely uncertain. The magistrate's chambers the following morning were crowded and close, and Charlotte's aunt sat rigid and furious near the front of the room, Fenwick himself present as well, his expression carrying none of the smooth confidence he had shown on his earlier visit to Ashbourne House. The proceedings were formal and lengthy, her aunt's solicitor arguing at length about the impropriety of a marriage contracted so quickly, so soon after a young woman's near-fatal accident, suggesting a vulnerability that had been improperly exploited. Charlotte listened to the accusations with a steadiness that surprised even herself, and when at last the magistrate turned to her directly and asked whether she wished to speak, she rose without hesitation. "I was not coerced," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded room. "I was rescued from a river by a man who owed me nothing and risked his own life regardless. I was cared for in his household with more kindness than I had known in years, and when a threat arrived at his door in the form of an arrangement I never consented to, he offered me his name not to control my future but to protect it. I chose this marriage freely, with a clearer mind than I have had about any decision in my life, and I would make the same choice again without a moment's hesitation, whatever anyone in this room believes about the speed of it." She looked directly at her aunt as she spoke the final words, and saw something flicker across the older woman's face, not quite shame, but perhaps the first honest doubt she'd allowed herself since the arrangement with Fenwick had first been made. The magistrate listened to the remainder of the arguments with visible impatience, and when Fenwick's own solicitor rose to press the matter of the outstanding debts, the magistrate cut him off with a sharp question about the precise nature of Fenwick's financial interest in the arrangement, a question that left Fenwick's solicitor stammering and Fenwick himself visibly pale. It seemed, the magistrate observed dryly, once the stammering solicitor had finished his inadequate answer, that Mr. Fenwick's concern for Miss Hale's welfare bore a curious resemblance to concern for his own creditors. He was not inclined, he said, to set aside a lawful marriage, properly contracted and freely entered into by a woman who had just demonstrated, quite ably, that she was entirely capable of speaking for herself, in order to satisfy an arrangement that appeared to serve everyone's interests but her own. A murmur of surprise moved through the gathered onlookers at the magistrate's swift ruling, and Charlotte felt Edmund's hand find hers beneath the table where they sat, gripping it with a relief so plain it needed no words to explain. She had expected, even after her own testimony, that the matter might drag on for hours more, or be deferred to some later date while further evidence was gathered. The magistrate's evident irritation with Fenwick's transparent motives had clearly hastened matters far more than either of them had dared hope. The challenge was dismissed within the hour, and Charlotte's aunt left the chambers without a single word of farewell, though Charlotte found she felt more relief than sorrow at the silence. The last tie to a guardianship that had never once considered her happiness finally, completely severed. Fenwick lingered only long enough to offer a stiff, resentful bow before disappearing from their lives entirely, and Charlotte never learned, nor particularly cared to learn, what became of whatever debts had driven his pursuit of her in the first place. They rode back to Ashbourne House in the late afternoon light, and Charlotte felt something settle in her chest that had been unsteady since the night of the storm, weeks and a lifetime ago, when the bridge at Marlwood had given way beneath her. "It is over," she said softly, more to herself than to Edmund, though he heard her regardless and pressed her hand gently in response. "It is only beginning," he said, "but the part that frightened you is over, yes." They arrived home to find Margaret waiting on the front steps, her face anxious until she saw their expressions and understood, before either of them had spoken a word, that the news was good. The household erupted into a quiet, relieved celebration that evening. Servants who had watched Charlotte's recovery from the very first night, now sharing in the joy of its resolution, and Charlotte found herself, for the first time since the river had taken her carriage, entirely at peace. Margaret embraced her without any of the usual reserve of a housekeeper toward the lady of the house, tears standing openly in her eyes. "I knew it from the first night," she said, holding Charlotte at arm's length to study her properly. "I told you then this house had answered harder questions than most, and answered them honestly. I am only glad I lived to see this one settled so well." The days that followed carried a quiet, settling happiness that Charlotte had never quite allowed herself to imagine during the long weeks of uncertainty. Word of the magistrate's ruling spread quickly through the county, and whatever whispers had followed the hasty wedding seemed to fade just as quickly once the full truth of Fenwick's motives became common knowledge among the local families. Lady Beatrice wrote again within the week, warmer still than her earlier letter, and promised to visit properly once the newlyweds had settled into the rhythm of their marriage. This time, she assured them, without a single pointed question about family or fortune. Charlotte spent her mornings now walking the same garden paths she had paced so anxiously during the weeks of waiting. Though the anxiety had given way entirely to a contentment she still found herself marveling at some days, as though she expected to wake and discover the whole of it had been some fever dream born of the river's cold grip. Edmund found her there often, and more than once set aside whatever business had called him away, to simply walk beside her instead, neither of them needing words to fill every silence anymore, the comfortable quiet between them worth more than any conversation. That night, standing once more on the terrace with Edmund beside her, she looked out over the dark water that had changed the course of her entire life, and felt no fear in it at all, only a strange, grateful wonder at how completely a single storm had rewritten everything she thought her future held. "I used to think that river only took things from me," she said. "My father took me across it as a child, and I lost him not long after. It took my carriage, my belongings, the arrangement my aunt had made for me. I am only now beginning to understand that it gave me something as well, something worth every single thing it took." Edmund drew her close, and together they watched the current move steadily on beneath the stars, carrying whatever remained of the storm's wreckage far downstream, leaving behind only the quiet, steady water that had, in the end, delivered her exactly where she was always meant to be. "I have been thinking," Edmund said after a long, comfortable silence, "that we ought to have the old bridge at Marlwood properly rebuilt, stronger this time, so that no other traveler need fear what you faced that night." Charlotte smiled at the thought, at the quiet generosity of it, so typical of the man she had come to know these past weeks. "That would be a fitting use for a duke's resources," she said, "though I confess I will always feel a strange gratitude toward that broken bridge, however much danger it caused. Without it, I would never have found my way to you at all." "Then perhaps," Edmund said, "we rebuild it, and mark it somehow, so that it remembers what it gave, as well as what it nearly took." Charlotte turned to look at him fully then, this steady, quietly generous man who had pulled her from the water with his own hands and never once, in all the weeks since, made her feel like a debt to be repaid rather than a person to be cherished. Whatever came next for them, whatever challenges still waited beyond the peaceful walls of Ashbourne House, she understood now with complete certainty that she would face them, exactly as she had faced the magistrate, and Fenwick, and her aunt's cold fury, with her hand in his and her heart entirely, finally, at home. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the river ran on below them, patient and endless, carrying the last of the old storm far out to sea, leaving behind only calm water and the quiet, certain beginning of everything still to come. Spring came early to Ashbourne House that year, and with it came a letter that neither Charlotte nor Edmund expected, sealed with a crest neither of them recognized and addressed in a hand that trembled slightly across the page. Charlotte opened it in the small breakfast room where she had once shared her first quiet meal with Edmund, and felt her breath catch at the signature waiting for her at the bottom. It was from the driver, the man she had believed lost that terrible night at the crossing, the one whose fate had haunted the edges of her memory for months, even as the joy of her new life pushed the guilt of his loss further into the background than she liked to admit. He had survived, the letter explained, carried nearly 2 miles downstream before catching hold of an overhanging branch and dragging himself onto the bank half drowned and badly injured. A farming family had found him the following morning, delirious with fever, and nursed him through weeks of illness before he was strong enough to travel, or even remember clearly what had happened to the carriage he had been driving. By the time his memory returned fully enough to think of writing, months had passed, and he had assumed with quiet sorrow that the young lady in his charge that night had not survived the crossing at all. Word had only recently reached him, through a chance conversation at a market town some distance away, that a Miss Hale had indeed survived and had since become the Duchess of Ashbourne. He wrote now, he explained, only to express his relief and to offer his sincere apology for whatever fear his failure to control the carriage that night had caused her. Charlotte read the letter twice through tears she did not try to hide, and carried it immediately to Edmund, who was reviewing estate accounts in his study. "He lived," she said, before he had even looked up from his papers. "The driver. He survived the river after all." Edmund rose at once, taking the letter from her hands to read it himself, and his relief was as plain and immediate as her own. "We must send for him," he said. "Whatever debt you feel you owe him for that night, I feel it as well. A man nearly died getting you safely across that crossing before the bridge failed entirely. The least we can offer him is our gratitude, and whatever assistance he requires to rebuild his own life after such an ordeal." They wrote back within the hour, inviting the driver, whose name was revealed in his letter as a modest man called Henry Cobb, to visit Ashbourne House at his earliest convenience, and enclosing funds enough to cover his travel with room to spare. Henry arrived 3 weeks later, still walking with a slight limp from injuries that had never fully healed, and wept openly when Charlotte greeted him personally at the front door, rather than leaving the welcome to a servant. "I feared I had killed you, madam," he said, his voice breaking. "I have carried that fear every day since I woke in that farmhouse and could not learn what had become of you." "You did everything a driver could do that night," Charlotte said gently, taking his weathered hands in her own. "The bridge failed through no fault of yours, and if anything, your steady hand at the reins kept the carriage upright long enough for help to reach me at all. I am the one who should be thanking you, not the reverse." Charlotte spent much of that first afternoon simply listening to Henry's account of the weeks following the accident, the fever that had nearly claimed him a second time despite surviving the river itself, the slow, painful process of relearning to walk on a leg that had been badly broken in the fall, and the quiet kindness of the farming family who had taken him in without asking for anything in return. She found herself grateful all over again, not only for her own survival, but for the survival of a man whose courage that night had never truly been acknowledged until now. Edmund offered Henry a position on the estate that very day, work suited to his still healing leg, overseeing the stables rather than driving, with wages generous enough that Henry's protests about undeserved charity were quickly overwhelmed by simple gratitude. He settled into a small cottage on the grounds within the month, and became, over the following seasons, something between a trusted employee and an old friend to both Charlotte and Edmund, always ready with a steady word of advice whenever either of them faced some new difficulty in managing the wide, sprawling responsibilities of the estate. The rebuilding of the Marlwood Bridge began that same spring, exactly as Edmund had promised on the terrace months before. He spared no expense in its construction, hiring the finest engineers from the county to ensure the new structure could withstand even the fiercest storms the river might someday throw against it. Charlotte visited the site often during its construction, watching the careful stonework rise course by course above the water that had once nearly taken her life, and found the sight brought her a peace she had not expected, a sense that something broken had finally, properly been mended. Henry himself took a quiet, personal interest in the bridge's construction, often walking down from his cottage to watch the stonemasons at their work despite his still healing leg, and more than once offered practical suggestions born of his own hard-won knowledge of the crossing's temperament in different seasons. The lead engineer, a careful, thoughtful man who had built bridges across half the county, remarked more than once that he had rarely met a layman with such a precise understanding of how a river actually behaved beneath its calm surface, and Charlotte suspected that no one alive understood the danger of that particular crossing better than the man who had nearly died in it. On the day the new bridge was completed, Edmund arranged a small ceremony to mark its opening, inviting tenants and villagers from across the estate to walk its span for the first time. A modest plaque was set into the stone at its center, engraved with words Charlotte herself had chosen after weeks of careful thought. It read simply that the bridge stood in memory of a night the river gave more than it took, and in gratitude to all who had shown courage in a storm. Lady Beatrice attended the ceremony, true to her earlier promise of a warmer visit, and stood beside Charlotte as the crowd gathered to watch Edmund cut the ribbon marking the bridge officially open. "I confess I misjudged you badly when we first met," Beatrice said quietly, watching her cousin address the assembled tenants with an ease and warmth Charlotte had come to know well over the intervening months. "I have rarely seen Edmund so entirely himself as he has been since your marriage. Whatever doubts I carried that first week, I have long since set them aside. I bear you no ill will for them," Charlotte said honestly. "You were protecting a family you loved from a stranger you had every reason to doubt. I cannot fault caution born of care, even when it stung at the time." Beatrice studied her for a long moment, something warmer than mere approval in her expression now. "You are a better woman than I gave you credit for," she said. "I am glad the river brought you to us, whatever chaos it caused in the doing." The summer that followed brought its own quiet joys, visits from Lady Beatrice that grew warmer with each passing month, letters from Henry's own small circle of friends thanking the household for the kindness shown him, and a steady, comfortable rhythm to life at Ashbourne House that Charlotte had never quite dared imagine for herself during those long, uncertain weeks after the accident. She began, gradually, to take on small responsibilities of her own within the estate, reviewing accounts alongside Edmund, visiting tenant families to hear their concerns firsthand, and found in the work a satisfaction she had not expected, a sense of belonging to something larger than her own survival at last. As the months passed into a full year since the accident, Charlotte found herself, one quiet autumn evening, once again on the terrace where so much of her new life had first taken shape, watching the river flow steadily past the new bridge in the fading light. Edmund joined her there as he so often did, wrapping an arm around her shoulders against the evening chill. "A year today," she said softly, "since the bridge gave way." He was quiet for a moment, considering the weight of the anniversary. "It does not feel like tragedy anymore," he said finally, "when I think back on that night. It feels like the beginning of everything I did not know I was missing." Charlotte leaned into him, watching the water catch the last light of the setting sun, gold and steady where once it had been dark and violent and full of danger. "I used to dream of that night sometimes," she admitted. "The cold, the panic, not knowing which way was up. I do not dream of it anymore. Now when I think of that river, I only think of you, coming through the water for me when no one else did." "I will always come for you," Edmund said, the old quiet certainty in his voice that she had come to rely on more than she had ever relied on anything in her life before. "Whatever storm finds us next, whatever current tries to carry you away from me, I will always come through it." They stood together as the sun finally sank below the tree line, the new bridge glowing pale in the last of the light, sturdy and permanent where the old one had failed, a solid promise standing over water that had once nearly ended everything, and had instead given them a beginning neither of them could have imagined. Behind them, the lights of Ashbourne House glowed warm against the coming dark, a home built now not on caution and calculation alone, but on the steady, hard-won knowledge that some rescues do not end when the water finally lets go. but continue quietly, faithfully, for the whole of a lifetime that follows.